Deputy Ballot Tribune.
Cuireadh Mágat, agus fáilte rómh an seo. For me, I suppose, just having read your report and having looked at some of the elements of the economy, it seems there's an awful feeling of déjà vu at the moment. While everybody, of course, welcomes the increased exchequer returns, there seems to be three elements that are manifesting themselves within the economy at the moment. One is the imbalanced economy at the moment, and that imbalance with regards to 90% of our exports coming from the FDI sector, and the imbalance within corporation tax, 70% of corporation tax, really the output of about 140 firms. So a very small pool we're dependent upon in that area. And then there seems to be a shifting of revenue towards more volatile, revenue generation towards more volatile revenue generation centres. For example, in the past we had the shift from personal taxation to stamp duty in the construction industry, and now we seem to have a shift from personal taxation towards the likes of the volatile corporation tax sector. And also in all of this, I think there seems to be an uncontrollable, in the crash of 2007, there was, in the lead up to that, there was an uncontrolled external economic factors such as low interest rates set by the EU, which also had a massive effect on the overheating of the economy at the time. And while obviously the bounce back is welcome in this economy, we have an enormous array of external economic factors in which the state has no control over, which are actually blowing very strongly in favour of the state. But as your report states, there's an output gap which is actually reducing quite fast, and there's a danger again of overheating in the economy, and that's quite shocking. Just a couple of questions. You seem to be saying that there are very strong echoes of government fiscal policy between now and 2000 and the government's pre-2007. Some of the volatility in the corporation tax seems to be coming from changes within accounting systems between some companies because of new corporate taxation rules. Would you say that that is a likely contributor to some of the overrun?
I would say at this point we don't really fully
but in your estimation,
understand it. It's certainly one of the possible factors. We're trying as best we can to get to the bottom of it ourselves, trying to improve our own sort of forecasting models for corporation taxes. But I think at this stage there is limited understanding really of what's driving the strength of corporation taxes, which means I think that we have to be very cautious in relying on the recent surge continuing in terms of funding permanent increases in spending.
You mentioned earlier also in the report that the fiscal space, the government now estimates the fiscal space to be around €8 billion. I think you discussed the fact that you figured that much of that fiscal space will actually be consumed by demographic pressures and just expenditure responsibilities that the state will have in that future. So that means your estimation that the actual physical space with regards to standstill of current delivery is far smaller. What would you imagine that to be?
One of the things that we emphasise in this report is the importance of medium-term plans being based on realistic medium-term projections. And one of the things that we note in this report is that the projections for expenditure don't fully allow for likely demographic growth, but even more importantly, given the rising cost of government services and benefits as a result of really general inflation in the economy, don't really allow for those cost pressures.
So the $4 billion tax cuts, for example, that's estimated with regards, that's not feasible?
Well, what we estimate is that using an alternative scenario for government expenditure that takes into account what we think is realistic provision for these demographic pressures and essentially indexes the budget, that would use up the bulk of the fiscal space that's available.
We seem to be still in the middle of an extreme pro-cyclical space. So in other words, we came from a very deep trough, and typically after a very deep trough you have a very strong bounce back, etc. And that's what's happening at the moment. Ideally, a government should be flattening out these ends of the cycle. But if you look at some of the Department of Finance research and estimates, they don't seem to take that into consideration at all. So, for example, the profile of corporation taxes, etc., and the profile of some of the other elements of the economy seem to be out of sync significantly with what the Department of Finance. What I'm saying, are you happy with the level of research and analysis that this state has with regards medium-term forecasting?
We've been saying in a number of reports, and we've been saying directly to the Department of Finance, that we believe that they really do need to strengthen their tools for medium-term forecasting, particularly for developing an understanding of the supply side of the economy. Some sort of good news on that front is that the Department of Finance are beginning to develop those tools. We're also engaged in a very significant research program ourselves to try to develop those tools. So both at the level of the Department of Finance and the level of the economics community as a whole in Ireland, we do need to develop a much better understanding.
And just a supplementary to that, if I can, you mentioned the fact that we could be at the edge of overheating, etc. What would the effect of €4 billion tax cuts by a government have on that?
Well, it would depend what was also happening on the expenditure side.
Yeah. But expenditures can't obviously retreat any further.
Well, assuming that the fiscal rules are binding, whatever you're going to do on the tax side is going to have to be essentially offset on the expenditure side.
But it would have,
given the amount
it would
of
have an inflationary
available
effect, would it not?
Well, if it wasn't offset, it would, but it would be very difficult to do that within the fiscal rules. So it's mainly sort of an issue of priorities, whether you want to prioritise tax cuts or you want to prioritise spending.
I mean, the general public would feel that what we've done is the right thing. Won't see it as they.
You might be mixed on that one.
Yeah.
Well, the trouble is, you'll be looking to spend more. You see, you think we're already not spending enough.
It's an issue necessarily of spending more. I think it's an issue of whatever you spend, you have to raise. Yes. And that's the issue. See, the problem is, the major difficulty in this state is we promise European public services on American tax rates, and that's the fiscal irresponsibility lies. If you promise European public services on a European tax rate, well, then you fit in and you make these people over here happy. And that's the key issue. And also then that you flatten out the cycle. So in other words, you take heat out of the economy when the economy is on the peak, and you put it back in when it's frozen. And in those two aspects, you're more likely to have an economy where people are confident that their house is going to be roughly the same price in about 20 years' time, rather than the massive shocks that we've had at the moment.
I think it is important that the general public know what your view is on that. That do you consider to be, is to say, a red alert, or whether you think that we should just see it as an orange alert? I think that's, that you're saying there's been a bit of aggro between yourself and government. There isn't really.
Yeah, no, I would say we do see this as serious. I don't want to get into the colour coding, because I think that is something that we haven't discussed.
I don't think there's aggro between the government and the council on this.
Well,
you have
I would say that
we accept that view.
Under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we have to assess the prudence of the fiscal stance. We wouldn't have said that there was a deviation from that prudent path that the government had been on if we didn't think it was serious. And it goes back to what we've been discussing all along, is that the main thing is that, for the longer term, that we really stop this pattern of pro-cyclical policy. What was done this year is very much fitting that pattern and very much against the spirit of the new framework that has been put in place. In that sense, we do think it's serious.
So to sum up, really, the Fiscal Council is saying there's a number of risks out there. One is pro-cyclical economic policy. Two is the lack of proper mid-term planning. Three are the trapped sectors within the economy itself, whether they be people in debt distress or people with maybe on low wages. And then, the fourth one will be debt. So if they need to be the subject of policy with regards evening out those risks to the economy.
Well, I would say on 1, 2, and 4, they are very much sort of part of our responsibility to look at.
Yeah, just go back to Deputy Rabbit and the Cahill. We obviously had a conversation, and one of the problems I have, I suppose, is that sometimes the right often figure that they own fiscal responsibility. But is it not the case that fiscal responsibility is neither a right or a left issue? Fiscal responsibility is about paying for the services that you deliver in a sustainable fashion, in that you can have low government, small government and small taxation, which ends up fiscally responsible in some ways, but you could have larger government, more public service delivery and more taxation delivered, and that, as long as it's balances itself in the long run, is fiscally responsible also. So that neither side can claim ownership of fiscal responsibility.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's really independent of what your view of the appropriate size of government is. And if anything, I would say the more you believe in government, the more you should believe in fiscal stability, so that you can make sure that you always have the funding there to pay for that government that you believe in. And we've seen what happens when you lose the capacity to fund it. That's what we saw in the crisis. So people refer to it sort of as austerity, but it was something that once you sort of lose access to funding and you have to turn to sources of official funding would come with conditions. It's something that's going to be impossible to avoid. So you want to not get yourself into those situations to begin with. And I think there would be something really positive that would come out of our interventions if we can make it not a party political issue or a left-right issue, but it's something that we sort of all believe in, so that we, whatever your sort of goals are in terms of the appropriate way to organise society, that we see fiscal stability and sustainability as instrumental to achieving those goals.